Welcome to Energy Unplugged, your go-to podcast for the global energy transition. I'm Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America. And today, we're delighted to be joined by Karin Burns, CEO of San Diego Community Power, one of California's fastest-growing community choice aggregators. We'll talk about exactly what community choice aggregation is, for those who don't know already, and how CCAs and other retailers are preparing for rapid increases in demand, adapting to federal and state policy changes, and really ultimately balancing efforts to decarbonize with also keeping bills low for consumers. And with a career spanning international finance, nonprofit leadership, private sector strategy and consulting, and the last few years as CEO of San Diego Community Power, I can't think of many better people to discuss all these things with than Karin. So Karin, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Oliver, for having me. And great to be here with Farhad. Thank you all.
Yes, I'm also joined by Farhad Bilamoria, head of our US West business based in the California Bay Area. Farhad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Oliver. Great to be here.
So before we dive in, Karin, I alluded to this in the intro, but you really do have an interesting career path that led you to the role that you're in today. I'm curious what it is about community energy that really motivates you. And perhaps what are the skills and experience that you picked up along the way that's best equipped you for the leadership role that you have today?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. Just to give a little bit of a background. So I became the CEO of Community Power in April of 2022. And really, I joined because it allows me to focus on the things I care most about, right? Building really high-performing collaborative teams that bring together diverse and global perspectives, catalyzing our clean energy transition, and investing back into communities and seeing those tangible benefits. So I get to do all three of those things here at Community Power, and that's what gets me really excited. And, prior to that, as we mentioned, I had been at regional operations at Franklin Energy, and then I was the chief executive at Build It Green. And then prior to that, I spent a decade in finance and international banking and venture capital and investments overseas. So crossing finance and then eventually crossed finance with clean energy and sustainability. And during that, about 7 or so years overseas, including a stint in London, I might add, it gave me a really global perspective and a firsthand look at some of the real environmental challenges and hotspots that are out there in places like Brazil, India, Indonesia, and China. And so that really informed a couple of things about my own perspective and what I bring to the role is one, the need for those different perspectives that we've got a lot going on, but also that, we have to act locally. And so with San Diego Community Power, I'm really focused on acting locally, have that global perspective, but what can we do here in this moment now? How can we advance this clean energy transition where the energy sector does make up an enormous proportion of our global emissions? And how can we help make a dent in this challenge locally here regionally? So that's sort of what gets me excited about this role, what impassions me, and how we think about being a values-led organization and some of the work that we're doing.
It strikes me as very similar to some of the reasons that I really like working for somewhere like Aurora. I sit here in Austin, Texas, but we have 1,000 people around the world covering global power markets. And it is really nice to have that global perspective. And I think what you tend to notice is that the energy transition looks somewhat different in every market, but a lot of the issues that countries and communities are facing are very similar. As renewables come onto the grid, that brings questions around intermittency, the role of batteries becomes more important, question of balancing decarbonisation with costs and reliability. These are all issues that different people are facing in different ways, and it's nice to be able to draw on that global experience. But at the end of the day, power markets are inherently very, very local, and you really need to be working at that local level to play a meaningful role. You're actually our first guest, I think, from a community choice aggregator. So for our audience who are outside of California, perhaps they've never heard of this before, can you explain what exactly a community choice aggregator is and what role does it play in the energy system in California?
Sure. So community choice aggregators, or CCAs, we'll use that term. It rolls off the tongue much easier. We are public, not-for-profit organizations, and we have taken over the responsibility of purchasing electricity from and providing that electricity through the poles and wires of the large independently operated utilities like San Diego Gas and Electric, Pacific Gas and Electric, and SoCal Edison. And then we also focus on programs and programmatic work to help shift load, shape load, and lower load on the demand side. So CCAs are locally controlled and managed. We have a board of directors that in our case is comprised of 7 member agencies. Those member agencies came together, opted in to the organization. We're a joint powers authority, technically, which is a government entity. And then that created choice for everyone. And so you could then opt up to our like a Power 100 or 100% renewable product. You could stay where you opted in at Power On, or you could opt down to a more sort of potentially more affordable product, and where you could opt out and say, hey, I really liked what I had before. I'm not really interested in making a change. And so one of the things that CCAs did is create choice for the first time. Normally, right, you come to your home, whether you buy it or rent it, and you get a bill, and that's it. You start paying your electricity bill. Now you have a choice. You can think about the different products. You can make electricity choices based on your values or your need set. And so that's one important thing. Another thing is we were really formed to bring cleaner, more renewable power to our communities and to do so in a way that was cost competitive and or affordable. Today, since our launch, we now serve about 1 million customers in the region. And our goal is to reach 100% renewable energy by 2035 or sooner. Typically, as mentioned, we do not transmit or deliver the power to our customers, right? We use the existing transmission and distribution or poles and wires of the large-scale utilities. I mentioned that. And because of that, customers who are enrolled in CCA service still only receive a single bill. And that's, because the meters are still owned and run and managed by the independently owned utilities. We're still a relatively new model. The first CCA was established in California in 2010. That was Marin Clean Energy, now known as MCE. But today, the model has really been very successful. We have 25 operating CCA programs across California, serving over 14 million customers. And to give you a sense of the size, that's about 26% of the total load of California, about 67 gigs, and that's in the fourth largest economy in the world. So we've really grown. We've really demonstrated that we can do a couple of things. We can help green the energy that's being produced. We can do this in a way that's competitive and or affordable. And we can invest back in our communities to help them have more control over their energy and help them lower costs by reducing demand through energy efficiency programs at source, but also shift and shape their load through exciting programs that we have related to virtual power plants and some other great work that we're doing to help folks really control the energy costs and shift their use out of those peak power hours.
That's really interesting, and thank you for that. And I think this is actually a really unique model that we see, and we see it as part of our global teams, a wide range of retail models, all the way from sort of fully regulated to competitive retail. And this I find is a really unique approach that California's taken. I guess one of the things that sort of jumps out for me is the status of a CCA is kind of, I guess, as you said, a joint powers authority, which is a form of government entity or agency, or maybe not, but if you want to explain that a little bit more, but be really interested to understand how you think about the governance of CCAs and particularly how you manage relationships with the range of external stakeholders that you're kind of working with in the energy system.
Sure. And there are quite a few. So let's start the microcosm of San Diego Community Power or Community Power. So we have a board of 7 elected officials that are appointed to our board from each member agency. So those might be the mayors of some of the smaller areas or a council member of one of the cities. So they're there they have a fiduciary duty, right? They help us set strategy. They're also representing their constituents who are our customers. And one of the really nice things about being a not-for-profit public agency is we get to focus on our customers, right? We, of course, need to be financially sustainable and strong, and that's something we've been building over the last several years. And we also need to build that renewable portfolio and continue that growth. At the same time, we can really put the customer in the room when we're making decisions. And we do that. And sometimes I'll even leave a chair and say, that customer is sitting in this room as we make this decision. How are we going to do this? And how are we going to be benefiting them? And so that's like a really key differentiator. And so there's this really strong alignment with both local government and also at the state level. So moving up to the CPUC and the CEC, where they do regulate parts of our business, but we get to set our rates. So with the IOUs, the independent utilities, their rates, they go through a process, right? A rate setting process, if you will, with the CPUC, but we get to set our rates locally. We do have to follow the growth and the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, and some of the other regulatory requirements of being a load serving entity like us. We have to follow resource adequacy requirements and other things that are mandated by the CPUC. But we do have a lot of local control, both on the rate setting side, on the different types of rates we might want to offer, and also on the programs that we can bring to our customers to help them with demand side management or reducing load at source, shifting out of peak hours.
I think in that context, maybe if we can kind of understand a little bit more about the specific kind of energy opportunities and challenges facing CCAs, particularly in sort of the current market dynamic and the scope and scale of change that we're seeing on a number of different fronts. But what are some of the things that sort of keep you up at night as the head of a CCA? And also what are some of the opportunities that you're seeing in the space?
Sure. Well, one of the things we think about is, well, on the one hand, we're a community-focused entity, we're a public agency, we're not for profit. On the other hand, we're in the commodities business. And that duality there can create some really interesting challenges, right? And so one of the challenges that we're dealing with right now is the passage of the Big Beautiful Bill, or HR 1, and how that's going to impact the renewable energy market, both in the short term and the long term. So the phasing out of the tax credits for both utility scale projects and residential solar and storage, as well as additional burdens from the tariffs and the foreign sourcing requirements, all of that will ultimately have a downstream effect on our ratepayers. And folks, different studies have been done to see how that will impact folks, and it's not going to be great, right? On top of this, we have incredible load growth happening with data centers for what is truly, beyond evolution in terms of artificial intelligence and how that's going to impact everything that we're seeing, right? It's very fundamental. We're even looking at it for what we can do to help drive efficiency, forecast accuracy. There's so many things that artificial intelligence will be able to enable and improve, and that will help with affordability in some cases, but it is going to create an enormous need for a lot of power. Where there's a latency issue, we will see that growth in California, which is probably less than 20% of the total growth. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to see a lot of growth right around with our neighbors. And that's important because some of those neighbors we can get a lot of power from. And so we're going to see tightening in the Western region as more load is built there. And we are also still having some electrification. We still hope to see that despite what's happened with the Big Beautiful Bill. And at the same time right now, prices are going down. So the price of brown power is going down, resource adequacy, coming off historical highs, I might add, though, right? Historical highs and extremely tight conditions. We are seeing decreasing prices in resource adequacy, renewables, and brown power in particular. And so that affects us through something called the power charge and difference adjustment, which is a mouthful and a whole half an hour just to focus on that. But it's basically when load departed from the IOUs, they wanted they wanted all those contracts that were purchased in the past, wanted customers to be indifferent from a price perspective on that level as to whether they stayed with the IOU or whether they went with CCAs. And so the PCIA is a way to balance that out. And it moves a lot depending on whether prices are high or prices are low relative to the original baseline and the contracts at the time of departure. So we have these market shifts. We also have that PCIA that we wrap in there. And then now we have the federal legislation kind of coming in. And, when you make business decisions in the power sector, you're making them 4, 5, 6, 7 years out. And transmission, even add that, that's 8, 10 years. So when you have this level of volatility, whether it's tariffs, whether it's tax credits, all of these things create more uncertainty on top of an already volatile market. And I think that's the challenge that we're seeing. So short term, we have about 10 power purchase agreements that we have signed and that are in progress, right? Good 8 of those feel really good about being able to be safe harbored, being able to secure those tax credits, not having too much tariff consideration. But there are some, and there may be more, that start to feel those impacts. And we'll need to talk to them about, how do we manage this? How do we partner to continue to build these assets, create great jobs here, green the grid, while facing these external challenges over which we have very little control. So I think those are the challenges, right? On the large scale bulk buying of power side of the business. On the other side, where we have a very bold goal to reach 150 megawatts of distributed energy resource power and resource adequacy here locally in the region. And that means deploying a massive virtual power plant. But that requires customers to have the capital and the desire to electrify their homes with devices, be they water heaters, heat pump water heaters, smart thermostats, electric vehicles, solar and battery additions, right? Those are all the things that we can use to flex through our flex load strategy and ultimately through a virtual power plant. But because of the big, beautiful bill, those incentives to consumers and customers have been cut off at their knees. Many of them sunset in 2025. There's a few leasing structures that will continue on through 2027. By and large, that cliff is happening. And that's really going to slow the scale and speed with which we can build that sort of really, resiliency in our region. And so that's been very challenging.
Just to stay at the local level, I mean, to what extent does that broader policy context impact? You mentioned a goal of 100% renewables. Is that meaningfully impacting your targets, or is there a way in which, particularly in California, you're somewhat shielded from some of the excesses of federal policy because there are such strong state level mandates and support for continued deployment of clean tech and energy transition more broadly?
So we're relatively in a strong position. Right? We moved fast. We locked in a lot of power purchase agreements. They started construction. So we can get to our 100% goal by 2035, and we can get to some of our interim targets. But that last piece, because of the federal changes to the ITC and the PTC, is going to be more expensive for all of us. And long term, different studies are saying different things, but we could see anywhere from a 7 to a 13 to 15% increase in residential electric rates across the country. Now, very specific, right? Super local. We think right now, the way prices are moving, that we won't immediately see the impact of this bill, because again, we're investing for the long term. There's going to be a short term. It's going to take some time to reverberate through the system. But I do think we'll see the challenges, whether that's if power becomes much more expensive because of the removal of the ITC PTC, but then the foreign sourcing requirements and the added tariffs and a lot of these components. China was very strategic in building the infrastructure and the industrial assets needed to produce clean power, right? Batteries, think about it, almost 80% of battery components come from China and other places. And that's the way it is. There were decisions made or not made that enabled or prohibited, but that's where we are in the world today. And so that's going to impact the cost. There's no way that these things won't impact cost. It's just a question of when and how much. And and you look at those costs, and then you add the load that is growing exponentially because of the need for data centers and the data, the power hungry AI training models and data centers, that the needs are there. And so you add those three, and it can get really challenging. So while we are shielded to a certain extent in the short term, I believe that we will all be experiencing this in a few years. We will be experiencing what decisions were made now in several years when we go to try and contract for new power plants. And the costs are very high.
Mm-hmm. And is there a point at which those costs start to result in something of a backlash? I mean, we're certainly seeing this in Europe to some degree. I mean, California has some of the highest retail rates in the country. It's a hot political topic. To what extent does that get conflated with the push or the mandates for clean energy? And is there a point at which this starts to become really unpalatable and a political hot potato that just has to be addressed?
I will say that for the last 3 years, we have seen energy, the generation side, like our portion of the bill has been going down. And in many other CCAs, not all, but many, and even with the IOUs, that has been happening. So it's less, and our portion of the bill is only 1/3. What's happening here is the transmission and distribution, right? We have to build more of it. Even if we build this we reached that bold goal of 150 megawatts, which would be one of the largest regional power plants. We still need transmission, right? And we still need to wildfire proof, if you will, the transmission that we have and the lines that we have. SDG&E is actually in a better place because of almost 40% of their lines are underground. This was a decision imposed upon them by the CPUC many years ago after a fire here that was particularly devastating. That same requirement was not made up north. And that is a much bigger area, right? I mean, PG&E has an enormous area that they have to cover. And so there's just a lot of investment needed, not only in upgrading and expanding. So you have to upgrade the system, you have to expand the system, and then we have to wildfire proof the system. That is an enormous amount of dollars. Like that's where it's going, right? And so we need to do those things. Those things aren't really optional, right? We have to do all three. And I think that's what makes our rates particularly challenging. So it's not so much the generation side as thinking about the investments, the enhancements, things that we need, making the grid more intelligent, right? Reconductoring, adding sensors. There's so much work that can be done there. And I'm not the T&D expert here, but I think there's a lot of need there. There's a lot of expense there, and there's a lot of opportunity too. And so that's where I think for our grid, the expenses start to manifest.
That makes a lot of sense. And we've all seen in recent years just how important that is, because when these things go wrong, they go wrong in a major way. I'd like to hand over to Farhad to talk a bit more about sort of how you plan for resource adequacy and system planning going forward. But just before we do, just to pick up on the 100% target, it's an interesting one because I think it's ambitious, and I think often it can mean very different things, and a lot comes down to this question of additionality. So there's a big difference between buying RECs from existing renewables, packaging them as a green tariff. I think that's what I have here in Austin, Texas, which tends not to lead to net new clean energy, versus something like a long-term bundle PPA, with new assets. So I'm curious how SDCP approaches procurement in general. Is it a mix of different strategies, or do you have a particular approach there?
So we do have a 100% target to get to 100% clean renewable energy by 2035 or sooner. We are looking to do that through long-term, 20-year-ish power purchase agreements. And so in the interim, though, we still want to build our renewable portfolios. So we go into the market and we buy short-term. But by and large, our focus has been contracting for those large assets that are going to be built. We have a very important regional goal of almost 1 gigawatt of regional energy to be procured within San Diego County, Imperial County, Riverside, where the labor market can move, if you will, is how we kind of classify that regional approach. But we also need to think about geographic diversity, right? Because of constrictions and nodal constraint, other things where we might have locational pricing differences. We want to make sure that we're diversifying just to the extent we can geographically. Also from the actual resource type. Right, we tend to be solar heavy because, again, we're locally focused. So what we have a lot of here is solar. We have some wind, but we are purchasing out of state wind or north state wind. And then we always want to have biomass. We also want to have geothermal. We look at hydro. It's considered clean, but not renewable by California law, which is a whole nother half-hour conversation. And then the state has extended the nuclear plant. So that will start to fill, that will continue to filter into our kind of generic power supply as well. So we're looking at geographic diversity, power source diversity as well when we're building our portfolio. But by nature, because of our goals, we will have we'll be slightly more heavy on the solar.
It's really insightful. And I think one of the things that struck me in your prior comments around the sort of the triple leg challenge that's facing California, it's sort of needing to keep the system resilient and robust to climate change, to extreme events, but also with this sort of additional burden of making sure it's affordable for everyone. And that's not an easy thing for any market participant to deal with, but it's also a tension that I think regulators need to think about when they're designing regulations and market design to actually get what we need out of the system. And so maybe to start with the high level, when as we kind of get into the sort of regulatory and market design aspects, is if the CPUC commissioners were kind of sitting from us today, is there a message or is there a set of messages that you would have for them?
Yeah, it's really one. It's one in particular, which is include us in the conversation. Still, because we're so new, we get forgotten or we're an afterthought. And we have a third of the load. Like, we're not small anymore, and we work really well together. So we speak as one voice through our trade organization called the Cal CCA, so California Community Choice Association. And we actually present a really balanced view. And because we're focused on serving our customers, and because we have that not-for-profit motive and that clean energy motive, our interests are actually very much aligned with those of our regulators from a values perspective. And so having us in the conversation can really help to balance the conversation and the outcome. And so that's my ask of it. And it's happening. It's just slow.
Yeah, I think the sort of the stakeholder forums for operators and regulators can kind of be a little bit of a club, right? Where it's sort of the same old folks can jump on. But yeah, definitely, I think that's a really good point. Maybe to kind of go into a little bit of the aspect of kind of resource adequacy, which I think is really important for California and really for everyone. But it's also an area where the regulators, CPUC, CAISO, have focused on quite a bit over the last few years. And one of the things I guess that I find quite unique and really interesting about, again, the Californian market design is it decentralizes a lot of the decisions around how to procure. And so, that gets put on CCAs or other load-serving entities around, setting kind of where the regulation sets almost how much to procure, but then how you do it and what terms you do it under, kind of decentralized to the market. And as a CCA, there's a really important role to kind of to fulfill that function. And I guess one question is, how do you see that role? Is that something that CCAs and particularly San Diego CP are well tuned to kind of manage? Is that something which is an inordinate burden? How are you feeling about sort of the scale of the responsibility that's sort of put on to CCAs when it comes to resource adequacy?
Well, and they're really put on all load serving entities, right? And then that our resource adequacy or RA is apportioned out. So, on the one hand, the decentralized approach gives us autonomy so we can manage our resource adequacy portfolio in a way that works best for us. And that may involve like individual hedging strategies and other things. It also does mean, though, that we're all competing to meet our obligations. And when RA is very tight in the market supply, which it has been significantly over the past 2 or even 3 years, that can be really challenging to balance the reliability with the affordability. And that's where, RA used to be this sort of afterthought in one's overall portfolio. And as prices went up and up and up, it started to take an increasing share of the cost of your total renewable energy portfolio. So what will happen in the coming years, remains to be seen. We have built a lot and we're building a lot on the battery side. But again, when you start thinking about large loads coming in, when you start thinking about electrification and just the forecast for growth, all things, forecasts are just that, forecasts. So things change, we know, but still. So on the one hand, it's a blessing. On the other hand, it can be a real challenge in terms of finding that RA. We had months where it was really challenging and really expensive to buy that resource adequacy. But we decided as an organization, you can do 2 things. You can not buy it and pay a penalty, or you can buy it and it sort of flows through as either you're not doing certain programs you might like to do, or you're not building the reserves of your organization as much as you would like to, or you're raising rates, right? It's sort of a little bit of a zero sum there in terms of when you add RA in. But we made the choice as an organization to be compliant with our RA obligations. And, it's a choice we have not regretted. And again, everyone's continuing to build resource adequacy. And I think as more batteries come online, we should see prices softening. And I think we're starting to see that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right on point. And maybe just to delve into that a little bit around the pace of change. We've seen million-ton reliability. We've seen slice of day. It's almost like we've kind of gotten through this bit and I kind of almost putting myself in the position of LSCs. It's like, oh, wow, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. and we're finally, we can now breathe easy. And now you've got things like the RCPP reforms that are, and I maybe should explain that acronym, Reliable and Clean Power Procurement Program, that the CPUC, so the Californian Public Utilities Commission, is putting into play. And just for listeners, that's essentially a program that's kind of been in the works over the last couple of years, but essentially aims to put in a longer-term framework for reliable procurement and clean power procurement in California. And it sort of intends to be dovetailed with the existing resource adequacy framework, but in some ways it also overlaps it. So just for background for listeners there. But again, for CCAs, one of the questions for me is, again, that pace of change, the scale of change. Is that manageable, or are you in a position where you're just like pulling my hair out just to kind of figure out what regulation means and when things are going to change again?
I have a favorite saying these days: both things can be true at the same time. So I think, the pace of change has been really rapid, especially around resource adequacy. We've had some changes in the PCIA, the power charge and difference adjustment, in terms of the market price benchmark for resource adequacy, which again is another half an hour conversation that I would prefer not to have. But at the same time, yes, so the RCPP is how we call it. And thank you for giving that explanation. It's an attempt to reduce, the way we see it from our perspective, it's an attempt to reduce these sort of one-off procurement orders that just come out. Right? They come out, oh, here you go, procure this, procure that, and we're all kind of rushing around. So the idea is, if we have a more strategy approach, if we're taking a longer term horizon, if we're aligning it with other frameworks, then it could be helpful. And I think that last piece is really, really important because of some of the other changes that have come in related to slice of day. Right? With slice of day is where you need in your peak month or any given month, that highest amount that you have, that peak RA need that you have on that particular day. Now you have to procure for that entire 24-hour period. Whereas before you just had to hit that peak hour period. Now it's for that whole day. And so that means a lot of potentially extra purchases, right? Because CCAs are advocating for what's called hourly trading. Because if you think about a curve, right? I just want to buy what I need under that curve. I don't want to have to buy above the curve, because that's just excess dollars that we're spending because we have to buy in strips of power. And that's where the hourly trading is so important in terms of cost savings. Now, again, it does make a difference when affordability is a key priority of both the administration and our customers. We want to do everything we can to keep those costs down. And hourly trading is one way to make that slice of day framework more cost effective. Right now, it's not in there. We're really advocating strongly for that inclusion. So that's one thing we're really looking for, because that'll help. That'll help everybody. That's a win-win. The second thing is, making sure that the frameworks are aligned, because we have so many regulatory obligations, and one's over here, this one does that. Sometimes they don't even, there can be conflicts within the regulations, right, about how to do certain things. And so adding another layer is only helpful if it creates clarity and consistency. If it doesn't do those two things, it's just going to burden us even more. And then the image of me pulling my hair out while trying to manage this is, a meme we should create. But it's a lot. It's a lot. And this is where I keep saying, hey, include us in the conversation and listen to what we're saying, because we're on the ground. We're the boots on the ground for the administration, trying to push that clean energy path forward, and having us in the conversation will help them understand how to do this. I mean, I was literally sitting, with someone from the governor's office, drawing the curve, explaining hourly trading, explaining why that's important, trying to do calculus on the fly on a napkin, and I'm like, okay. But at least we were there having the conversation, right? And the lights went on. Oh, now I get it. When you draw it out for me, because this is very esoteric, these are electrons. Who sees electrons, right? You see what they do, but you don't see them. And so it's more of it can be harder to visualize some of these things. So I try to make things visual where I can for folks. And we really try to break it down to language that folks can understand, so that when when folks are making policy or trying to do the right thing, which I believe folks are trying to do, the unintended consequences of trying to do the right thing without all the information don't kind of come back to haunt us later.
I think that's a really eloquent phrasing of the sort of regulatory challenge right now. It's like, do it if it actually makes sense and it actually helps folks make the right decisions. If I can sneak in one more kind of wonky power topic, and then that's the issue of regionalization. So we've sort of seen this in the West for a long time. It's been talked about, and we're sort of finally at the edge of now where we've got, not the sort of single West-wide market that many of us had envisioned many years ago, but we're going to have this sort of jigsaw puzzle, but nevertheless, it's going to be regionalized. How does that play into your decision making and your thought process around, because obviously your core focus is not just California, but even more local. How does the regionalization dynamic play into your decision making?
Sure. No, I appreciate this question actually, because there are some things folks should know, right? I mean, I think first it's important to understand like what regionalization means, as it have different meanings for different people. And as you explained, it's evolved over time. For us, for Community Power, we see benefits in the Pathways Initiative in particular. And its associated legislation. That's SB or Senate Bill 540, authored by Becker. And it's really about creating independent governance to facilitate a Western regional market. It's not the same concept we were debating 5 years ago, as you pointed out, which was a full-fledged regional transmission organization. So we're really just talking about the market. Why we care about this is because it will lower costs, first and foremost. Again, going back to that overarching theme of affordability, where we can get it. Studies show that through more efficient resource dispatch and use of the transmission, California could save up to $700 million a year. For us, 95% of our budget is for power. And so a regional market could help us manage our wholesale power costs, manage some of those resource adequacy costs as well. It will also help the grid become more reliable. I think there was a recent study done by Stanford showing that the regional market could reduce at-risk hours for the grid by as much as 40%. And then I think it will help us achieve our clean energy goals more quickly. I think there was a recent study by Brattle, I think it was, that suggested that natural gas generation could be reduced by as much as 31% in California if we could more efficiently use our renewables. I would also say this. I think this is the important takeaway in my mind, is that the status quo right now is not an option for the future. There won't be a status quo. There is strong competition from another regional contender called the Southwest Power Pool, based out of Arkansas. And if our neighboring states join that market, that's bad for California, because that means we have less those resources will start flowing in that direction. We will have less out-of-state resources that could help us balance some of these challenges. And so we don't really have, for a while we had the option just to do nothing. That's not an option anymore. And that's, I think, what we also shared with with folks up in the governor's office and in California, really broadly in the state level, is doing nothing is no longer an option. Things will change. It's a question of, do they change in our direction? Do they support California and our goals and our growth? Or they do go in a different direction, which could actually raise prices, reduce reliability, and cause more construction. So that's how we think about it. And that's why we're in support of the Pathways Initiative.
And certainly how exactly this plays out and what it means for consumers, for generators, is probably one of the biggest things we're tracking, and Farhad and his team are spending a whole lot of time on right now. There's so much more to dive into, but I think this is probably a good time to wrap up. So Karin, just before we do, one of the ways we sometimes like to end is to ask, what's one thing that you've been reading or listening to lately that you perhaps recommend to some of our listeners out there?
Okay. Well, so there's a couple of things. This is sort of foundational reading for anyone really interested in the California energy market. I happen to think it's called California Burning. It's a book written by a journalist. We've all probably read it 3 times over, but for folks that are, kind of trying to understand, how did we get here? In my mind, that book really helped in a clear, sort of unbiased way to help understand, how did we get here, where we are today? And that sort of, when I think about the market overall, helps form the foundation. Another thing I've been just watching a lot closely are, what's happening with artificial intelligence, because really I think we're going to see a lot of great breakthroughs and opportunities for improvements and growth and cost reduction are going to be with some of our older economy, or, real economy, let's say, not old economy, real economy industries like the utility space, right? There's a lot of opportunity for us to harness that to do good things. And so that's something I'm paying attention to. You'll see there'll be some podcasts that'll say, it's the end of the world as we know it. This is terrible. And everyone's, this is going to be utopia. Like literally, I watched 2 different podcasts where they come up with those two. The truth is always somewhere in the middle, right? And so I think it'll probably roll out a bit like the internet. So there'll be some really great things and great advances that'll happen. And there might be some bad actors in the system too. But for us, when I think about it here locally and for community power, it's about how can we do more for our customers, right? Without raising costs. How can we get better accuracy? How can we really understand our data and then use that for good? These are the things that I think artificial intelligence can do for us. So I'm just paying attention to lots of voices in that space right now and, learning what I can about it so that I can help guide our organization into that future in a way that's safe, that's protecting people's private information, that's reducing our costs and enhancing our products and services at the same time.
Great. And fully agreed on the Catherine Blunt California burning. She was on our podcast, I think episode 129, if you'd like to go back and have a listen for those of you who haven't read the book. But yeah, fantastic overview of the current state of energy in California. Well, Karin, it's been wonderful to have you as a guest on the podcast today. We've both really enjoyed the discussion. So thank you for your time and look forward to catching up with you in due course to see how all of this is going.
Thank you. And likewise, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the work that you all are doing at Aurora Research. Really great, insights that we all need. So thumbs up for the work you all are doing. Really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on the podcast. And this was fun. Thanks.
That was Karin Burns, CEO of San Diego Community Power, talking to Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America, and Farhad Bilamoria, Head of Aurora's US West Business. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow the podcast via whatever platform you use.